Okay, so let's pick up where we left off. We talked about classes, and our example that we've been working on reviewed what we had done in the end of the 30S course in classes. Okay? So just as a quick review, we did a person class, okay, which had two properties and two methods. One was a constructor method, one was a talk method. Then we did a student class, which had one property, which was private or encapsulated. It had a constructor method with parameters. Remember, one without parameters is called a default constructor. And it has a talk method that overrides the talk method of the person class because we've initiated inheritance by extending the person. If you understood all the words I just said, that shows how far your programming has come. Like, those were some pretty intense words, including encapsulation, inheritance, private, public, all that stuff, constructor. So that's good. In a way, that's the way that course left off. But there was one new thing that we added last class. This keyword here, protected. That keyword is new, and I'm going to explain it to start off today. And then we had our testing class where we actually did the testing. Okay? So that's where we left off. So here's what protected is about. Okay? In the past, we've written methods. Wait, sorry, this is not right. Oh, I'm sorry, that's the wrong spot. Okay. Actually, before we do it, let's go to our person class, and let's add another property. Okay, we have the name, we have the age. Let's add another one, another protected method, a Boolean, remember this one, is male. Okay, so is male will store the person's gender, true or false. Let's add it to the default constructor. Do you remember the way we said it last year? Is male, what's the default? Those of you who study biology should know this. By default, all fetuses when first born are female, so we're going to set is male to false. Even though it's John Doe, actually maybe we should change that now. Maybe it should be Jane Doe, okay? So Jane Doe is 0 and is not a male. That's the default setting for a person. All right. Now, in addition, we're going to modify the student class. The student class, as you can see, modified the name by passing it through a parameter, but we're also going to now use the student class to modify the gender as well. Okay? Yeah, we're going to be a little bit sexist. We're going to set is male to true. So if it's a student is male. This is a whole sociological statement here. You know how some women aren't allowed to have education in some parts of the world. So we're making a very sexist program here that when you become a student, you are set by default to be a male. Okay? Let's add this to our talk method as well. So let's add that name is that age plus is male is male. How about is a male is true or false? So that will be added to the talk method of the person class, so it outputs all three pieces of data. The name, the age, and the gender will be outputted through the talk method. Remember, the student class also calls the talk method of the person class, so it should be outputted as well. So now when we run our advanced classes test, we should see that this person is not a male, and this person is a male. If it works out, let's run it. Okay? So Jane Doe, 17, is a male, is false. Student E. McStudentson is 16, is a male, is true. So you can see there the override is happening, and things like that, and the student numbers also being displayed with the student. Any questions so far? Okay, so this is also in the notes in a slightly different form, but in the notes you can see here I've highlighted the fact that something is protected and that it's used within the code. Okay, so here's the explanation. we saw and have been using the use of packages. So here's a definition. Packages are a mechanism to group Java classes that are related to each other in the same package or the same module. When a Java project grows too big, for example, when you make it into a larger app or you're making a library of code like what's called an API. Do any of you know what API stands for? The A stands for application. Close, program interface, right? Very close. Split the code into multiple Java classes and the classes into multiple packages. The thing about packages is it allows you to have classes with the same name. So you can, for example, have two-person classes as long as they're in different packages. This is like you can have two variables of the same name as long as they're in different methods, right? A Java package can be thought of like a directory in a file system. It helps organize your classes into directories, so to speak. In other programming languages, for example, C#, they use the term namespace instead of package. And actually, if you go back and look at your C# code, you'll see that keyword namespace appear there, okay? Now, packages can contain sub-packages, which we've now done. We've put a package in a package, creating a whole structure of packages, okay? Which again is like a directory structure. Okay. Now, here's the next thing I want to teach you. Every single class already has built into it a superclass. In other words, a parent class. Every single class in Java comes from a class called the object class. Okay? Every class comes from object. So let's take a second to write some code with that. So actually, let's back it up to our advanced classes test, and let's write it even before the person. So we had a person, we had a student. Let's make an object. Object equals new object. This is built into Java. The object class is it is the most simplest of classes, okay? And actually it has, I believe, no constructor methods other than a default. The only way you can make an object is with a default constructor because it doesn't know what it is. It's just an object. But here's what's interesting. If I type object, and by the way, what is this? Is this a class or an object? This is the class, that's the object, right? So I know I'm saying the word object a lot. But if I put a dot, you'd say, well, there must be no methods in this thing and no properties. But you'd actually be wrong. There actually already is a bunch of methods built into the object class. It has all these methods sort of waiting there for you. Now, the reason it has those is because every single class inherits from the object class. So for example, the string class, which is something built in. A string is an object. The math library, which is a class, math is a object. The JOptionPane library, which is a class. JOptionPane is a object. When we build a class, like the person class, a person is an object. You don't have to extend it. It's just going to happen automatically. Every single class comes from the object class. So, since the object class has these methods in them, every class we write has the ability to call these methods even though we don't have them. And I just want to sort of prove that to you. If you look at those methods right there, just quickly just scan them over. And now I go back to, say, the student class, and I look at its methods in the student class. It has the methods we wrote, like talk, but notice those same methods appear there because they're coming from the object class. Okay? So that's just something that just automatically happens, is the object class is just part of what we need when we are working in coding. So, since object is the superclass of every single class, by the way, that includes arrays, okay? It inherits those methods. You, as the programmer, can actually override those methods as well. You can just override them, like you can with any other class. And I'm going to suggest that there are some you should override. Here are some of the methods that are built in. One is an equals method. It indicates, this is how it can check to see if one object and another object are equal. We're going to talk more about that when we look at memory in a few minutes or tomorrow. Okay? The method called the toString method is built into every class. This is useful because you often want to do things like output the class. And as a result, it's handy to turn your class into a string so that it can be put out into things like system.out. Then, this is an interesting one. There's a method called the clone method. The clone method duplicates the object. This is useful even in things like gaming where you want to just keep cloning objects all over the place and creating new ones as it gets cloned. Okay? Then there's a couple of methods here that actually, like there's one called finalize, there's one called getClass, there's one called notify all, wait, etc. Those I'm actually going to not recommend that we override. These methods are used by things like what's called threading, when it uses multiple threads to run programs, which we may get into if we have time. But generally, those are ones you don't need to override, and we don't need to go into too much detail. As a matter of fact, finalize is actually not included in Java anymore. Okay? From now on, though, here's my advice. Every single time we create a new class, we should just, by default, write these three methods. We should just write them. And from now on, that should just be your sort of system, is to rewrite them, and you'll override them every time you do that. It will lead to better coding down the line. Okay? So we're going to do that. We're going to override these three methods in our example. Okay? All right. So, let's omit the person class. Let's leave it as it is. But let's go to our student class, and let's write those methods. Okay? So the first one is the public string toString method. Whoops. And it looks like that. Public string to string, because it returns a string, and the method's called toString. It turns your object into a string. So obviously this thing has to return something, but you'll notice the light bulb actually suggests something else. It suggests that you add this thing called the override annotation. The override annotation just means that it recognizes that this is an override method. Talk had that as well, by the way, because talk was overriding the talk method of the person class. This thing here with the @override is basically like a comment. It's just an indicator. Now you'll also notice something else nice happens in NetBeans. It puts a little icon there, this little circle, green circle icon. That's a visual cue that this method is an override method. Okay, that's good. Okay, now in addition to that method, we'll leave it sort of empty for now. We're also going to write the equals method. Public equals, okay, whoops. Right, thank you. Boolean, equals is a true-false method. It either equals or it doesn't. Now, the parameter for this can be two things. One, we're generally going to check to see if one student equals another student. So inside the equals method, you could put student, student. But I'm actually going to suggest we say object, object. And that way it's a little more generic. It just checks to see if the student object equals some other object. And this will then be recognized as an override method. Add override. Okay? And then finally, the final method is the clone method. Public. Now, what the clone method returns is it returns an object of the same class. So for that, we're going to return a student object called clone. And again, it's going to ask you to add the override annotation.
Can you show us how to create these three things in a template so in the future?
We're going to do that, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up, Peter. That's what I was going to suggest. So because I'm going to suggest that this should be done every single time you write a class, I'm going to actually suggest that we edit these into our NetBeans template. But before we do, we should probably comment them so that the comment also goes into the template. Okay? So I'm just going to pause the video for a second because I think. Okay, so here is those 3 methods, and we're going to take them into our NetBeans template. So select all 3, including the comments, copy it, go to Tools, Templates, go down to Java, Java class, and open it in the editor. Okay? So we had already done this, right? We had already put in some code into this template. So now we're going to go inside the class right here and paste in those 3 methods. So there they are. The one we have to change, though, is the clone method. We don't want to leave it as student. We want it to clone the name of the class. So we can get that from up here, this thing that says $name. You want to put that in place of student right there. So when I create a new person, it'll put public person clone. It'll pick up the name of the class. And by the way, let's actually add one other thing to this template as a suggestion. A default constructor. So let's make a public name bracket bracket colon colon. This is a spot where you have to put in the default constructor code, and we might as well put a comment on it. Okay, Java, and then class, Java, and then open it up, and then Java class, and then open an editor. Okay, so I'm going to also do this. I'm going to put in /**. This is the default, default constructor. /*. Okay, so this is now just part of our template.